I don't know how to start this, but I need to get it out. I still can't believe it happened. It was supposed to be an ordinary move, a quiet new beginning. My name is Nate Mitchell, and I'm originally from New York City. But things had gotten too loud, too chaotic for me. I needed peace, space, a place where I could breathe again. That's when I found the house. It wasn't much, just a small cottage on the outskirts of a place called Thornfield, quiet, isolated, a perfect escape. Or so I thought. I arrived in early autumn, the sky overcast with clouds that seemed to hang heavier than they should. The air smelled of wet earth, like rain had passed through but never truly left. The town was smaller than I expected. The streets were lined with old, decaying houses, some of which were abandoned for years, their windows boarded up as if to keep something inside. The first sign that something was off came from the town's inhabitants. There weren't many people, maybe 30 or 40 residents, but they all had a certain, dead look to them. I couldn't put my finger on it. Their eyes were dull, distant, almost like they weren't really there. I remember passing a woman near the old general store. She smiled at me, but it wasn't warm. It was almost too perfect, like it was rehearsed. That night, after unpacking, I sat on the porch, sipping on some whiskey, trying to enjoy the silence. The wind howled softly through the trees, and the darkness felt deeper than usual. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the middle of the street. At first, I thought it was a shadow, maybe a trick of the light, but then it moved. A tall man, thin, wearing an old trench coat. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just another resident. But the feeling stuck with me as I went inside and locked the door. I tried to shake it off, but my mind kept going back to him. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something, or someone. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning. The beginning of the nightmare that would slowly creep into my life in Thornfield. The next morning, I tried to shake off the eerie feeling I had the night before. After all, it was probably nothing. Maybe the man was just a local, minding his own business. But that afternoon, when I ventured into town, things only got stranger. The people were all going about their business, but they weren't quite right. There was an odd tension in the air, like everyone knew something I didn't. I went into the diner to grab a coffee. A woman named Marla served me. She was in her late 40s, gray streaks in her hair, but her smile was too wide. She didn't talk much, just nodded when I asked her about the town and made vague comments about the weather. But then, without warning, she said something that chilled me. "You'll get used to the quiet," she said, staring at me with an intensity that felt almost unnatural. "It's not like the city, you know. Sometimes, it feels like things are watching you. Listening." Her words lingered in the air, and I could barely focus on anything else for the rest of the conversation. When I left, I couldn't shake the thought. Things watching you. Listening. I couldn't make sense of it. Was she just making small talk? Was it some local quirk I'd have to get used to? Or was there something deeper going on here? That night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, faint whispers coming from the walls. It was like someone was right next to me, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. My heart began to race, and I sat up, my ears straining. I pressed my ear to the cold wood of the wall. It was almost like a low hum, repeating, rhythmic. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard something else, a tapping on the window. I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears as I cautiously got out of bed. I crept over to the window, pulling the curtains back just enough to peer outside. There was nothing there. I sighed with relief, but the tapping continued. It wasn't on the window anymore, it was coming from inside the walls. Soft, rhythmic, like someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. I don't know why I did it, but I grabbed a hammer from the garage and started tapping back. I don't know what I expected, but the moment I did, the whispers stopped. Everything fell silent. I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I went back to bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. And for the first time since I arrived, I felt truly alone, completely alone, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The next day was odd. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling from last night. It felt like the house itself was holding on to something, some kind of presence. But I tried to move on. I told myself I was just tired, that the stress of the move and being away from the city was getting to me. I decided to take a walk through the woods behind my house, trying to clear my head. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves, and everything felt off. The trees here were different than back home. Their branches twisted and gnarled, like they were reaching out for something. I could hear the sound of something scurrying in the underbrush, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The further I walked, the quieter it got, until I could barely hear my own footsteps. It was then that I found it. An old, abandoned cabin. It was almost hidden beneath a thick layer of vines and overgrowth, like it had been forgotten for decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it. The wooden door was hanging off its hinges, and the windows were cracked, the glass shattered in places. I stepped inside. The air was stale, and the floor creaked under my weight. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay, but there was something else in the air, a faint, sickly sweet scent that I couldn't place. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood as if someone had done it by hand with something sharp. There was a single chair in the center of the room, facing away from me, as if someone had been sitting there, waiting. The air felt thick with tension, and as I walked further inside, I felt the weight of something looking at me. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but again, nothing. No one. Just silence. That's when I heard it. The whispering again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the cabin itself, as if the very air was alive. Low, guttural, almost like breathing. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a pressure that made me gasp for breath. I stumbled backward toward the door, desperate to get out, but the moment I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. My heart nearly stopped. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. The air was thick with it, pressing in on me from all sides. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, screaming, but the sound was muffled, as if the cabin itself was swallowing my voice. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The pressure lifted. The door creaked open slowly, as if letting me go. I didn't wait another second. I ran out of that cabin faster than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, but I didn't stop until I reached my house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, and didn't leave for days. But even then, the silence of Thornfield was deafening. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. That something was still out there, watching me. Following me. And I could feel it, closing in. The days blurred together after that. I stayed inside, barely leaving the house except to gather supplies. I couldn't bring myself to venture back into the woods, and I avoided the town as much as possible. The unease I felt was getting worse. Every time I looked out the window, I'd catch the flicker of something moving just beyond my line of sight, shadows darting between the trees or along the edges of the street. It was like they were waiting for me. I tried to distract myself by fixing up the house. I told myself that if I just focused on something normal, something mundane, I could get my mind off what had happened. But no matter how much I cleaned, no matter how many repairs I made, the house still felt wrong. The walls were too thick. The windows too small. The air too stale. And then came that night. The worst one. I had just finished dinner, something simple, nothing special, and decided to take a shower. I don't know why, but for the first time since moving in, I felt the strange urge to feel clean, to rid myself of the nagging weight that had been on me ever since I arrived in Thornfield. As the hot water poured over me, I began to relax. But just as I reached for the soap, I heard something. It was faint at first, a scratching sound, like nails against glass. My skin went cold. I froze. The noise was coming from inside the bathroom. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The bathroom was small, the mirror fogged up from the steam, but there was nothing there. I breathed out, trying to calm myself. I must have imagined it. But then it came again. Scratching. Faint, but unmistakable. I grabbed the towel from the hook and wrapped it around myself, eyes darting around the room. The sound was coming from behind the walls again, but this time, it wasn't just one place, it was all around me. It was like the walls themselves were trying to communicate with me, but the noise didn't make sense. It was like something was trying to claw its way through the walls to get to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed out of the bathroom, barely managing to stay on my feet as I slipped and nearly fell. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a broom, and began to bang it against the walls, hoping to scare whatever it was away. Then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. A voice. Low, distorted, like it was coming from deep within the earth. You shouldn't have come. I froze, the broom hanging in midair. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The tone was guttural, inhuman, like it didn't belong in this world. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the broom and stumbled backward, bumping into the wall as I made my way to the door. That's when the lights flickered. The house groaned, like something heavy was moving beneath it. The floor beneath my feet shook as if the foundation was cracking. I bolted out the door, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran out into the street, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to get away. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The street was empty. No one was there. I spent the rest of the night on the porch, clutching a flashlight, too afraid to go inside. I couldn't explain it. My mind was racing, piecing together all the strange occurrences, the whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. That was the night I realized, whatever was in Thornfield, whatever was in that house, wasn't going to let me leave. It had marked me. And now it was coming for me. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers again, faint but persistent. I tried to convince myself I was losing my mind. That it was just stress, just the isolation of being in such a small town. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And the longer I stayed in Thornfield, the more I felt like I was sinking into something I couldn't escape. I decided to go back to the cabin in the woods. Maybe if I could figure out what had happened there, I could make sense of everything. The idea made me sick to my stomach, but I had to know. I had to understand why this was happening, why this town felt like it was swallowing me whole. So, the next afternoon, I drove back to the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I expected to find. The cabin was still there, just as I left it, hidden behind a tangled mass of trees and vines, the air heavy with the same oppressive silence. I walked inside, hesitant, my breath sharp and shallow. The cabin had an unnatural coldness to it, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. The same symbols marked the walls, each one more twisted than the last. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But it was the chair in the middle of the room that drew my attention. It wasn't empty this time. Someone, or something, was sitting in it. The figure was hunched over, facing the wall, its back arched in a grotesque manner. I could barely make out any details, but its presence was suffocating, like the room was closing in around me. My feet felt glued to the floor, and I couldn't breathe. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, pulling me in. Who are you?" I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, but I could feel the air shift. Slowly, the figure turned its head. The movement was slow, unnatural, as if it wasn't supposed to be moving at all. What I saw made my blood run cold. Its face was wrong. It was pale, stretched too thin, its eyes wide and unblinking, as if they were too large for its skull. Its mouth was wide open, but no sound came out. The skin around its lips was cracked, like dried clay, and the blackness inside its mouth seemed to go on forever. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its gaze locked onto mine, before it slowly, deliberately, began to rise. I turned and ran, stumbling through the underbrush, too terrified to look back. The sounds of footsteps followed me, slow at first, then faster, as if whatever it was getting closer, gaining on me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key in the ignition. I floored the gas pedal and sped back to town, not daring to look in my rearview mirror, terrified that I would see that thing following me. I didn't return to the cabin. And I didn't go back into the woods. But the horrors of that place had followed me. They were still with me. That night, when I got home, I locked every door, closed every window, and sat on the floor, my back against the wall. I had no idea what I was supposed to do, where I could go. All I knew was that whatever haunted this town, whatever it was that had its eyes on me, wasn't done with me yet. I heard it again that night, the tapping. It started faint, like before, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. It was coming from inside the house, from the walls, and it sounded like something was trying to claw its way through. But this time, I wasn't just listening. I felt it. The walls of the house were vibrating. The floor beneath me was shaking. The air in the room thickened, as if something was pressing against it, pushing it, like it was trying to break through. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The house was quiet again, but the silence was deafening. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure: Thornfield wasn't just a town. It was a trap. And I was its prey. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing up and driving as far as I could. But no matter where I went, I knew it would follow me. Whatever was in the walls, in the trees, in the very ground of this place, it would find me. It always finds its prey. And it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. I didn't know what I expected that night, but it wasn't what happened. I stayed awake, watching the clock tick by, waiting for something, anything. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want to dream of that thing in the cabin, or the shadows that had followed me into my home. But somewhere between exhaustion and terror, I drifted off. The dream was immediate, like it had been waiting for me. I was back in the cabin, but this time, everything was different. The air was thick with a suffocating, oppressive energy. The walls of the cabin were pulsating, as though the house itself was alive. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, as if they were burning with some ancient, unholy fire. The figure in the chair wasn't there anymore, but I could feel its presence, staring at me from the dark corners of the room. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The shadows in the room began to move, shifting, growing. They twisted and warped, stretching into grotesque shapes that I couldn't quite make out. I felt like I was suffocating. The air was thick with the sound of whispers, low and guttural. They were coming from all around me, from every corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in my mind, each syllable digging into my consciousness like a sharp, cold blade. I turned to run, but the door was gone. The walls had closed in on me, and the only way forward was deeper into the suffocating darkness. I could hear something breathing behind me, something that wasn't human. I felt the weight of its gaze on my back, and I knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for me. But then, just as quickly as it started, the dream changed. I was outside, standing on the edge of Thornfield. The town looked different. Darker. The buildings were decayed, crumbling into dust. The streets were empty, except for the pale figures that stood at the end of each street, staring at me. Their eyes were hollow, lifeless, like they had been standing there for centuries, waiting. And then I saw him. The man in the trench coat, the one I had seen standing in the street when I first arrived. But this time, his face was clear. His eyes were wide, empty sockets, black as night. His lips twisted into a grotesque grin, and he spoke. "You're one of us now." The words felt like ice running through my veins. I tried to move, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. The figures around me began to move, slowly at first, then faster. They were closing in, surrounding me, their eyes never leaving my face. I woke up with a gasp, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. My surroundings were exactly as I had left them, dark, silent, suffocating. But I could feel something was different. The house had changed. The walls were no longer just walls. They were alive. I could hear scratching again. But this time, it wasn't just from the walls. It was coming from the floor, from the ceiling, from everywhere. I felt the floor vibrate beneath me, like something was moving beneath the house. The whispers were back, louder now, but not just whispers, voices, human voices, calling my name. I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. I wasn't going crazy. I couldn't be. Something had happened. Something was in the house with me. I grabbed a flashlight and tried to calm my breathing, but every step I took toward the hallway felt heavier. The air seemed thicker, as though I was walking through molasses. I moved cautiously, stepping softly, afraid of making any noise. Then I heard it again. The tapping. It was louder now. More distinct. It was coming from the floorboards, beneath my feet. Something was trying to get out. The house wasn't just creaking anymore. It was alive. I pointed the flashlight at the floor, and for a moment, I saw something. A dark shape, shifting, moving underneath the boards. I dropped the flashlight and it rolled across the floor, illuminating the ceiling. I swear I saw something moving above me, something following me. I backed up, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just old. It was part of it. It had been built on top of something, something ancient. And whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. I could feel the floor beneath me tremble again. The walls groaned. And then, the door at the end of the hallway slammed open by itself. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I bolted out the front door, slamming it behind me, my heart in my throat. The air outside felt almost too fresh, like I had just been released from some kind of prison. But when I looked back at the house, it was different. The windows were darker. The house was alive, shifting, almost breathing. And then, I saw it again. The man in the trench coat, standing in the window. His empty eyes stared at me, and this time, I heard his voice, clear as day. "You'll never leave." The words burned through me. I knew then, with terrifying certainty, that Thornfield wasn't just some town. It was a place. A place that never lets go. And no matter how far I ran, it would always follow me. I don't know how much time I have left. I don't know what it wants, but I can feel it coming again, closing in. And if you're reading this, just know one thing, Thornfield will find you. It always does. I didn't go back to the house. I couldn't. The image of the man in the trench coat haunted my every step, and the thought of those empty eyes made it impossible to look anywhere but forward. I left Thornfield that night, driving away as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't see the town in my rearview mirror again. But the truth is, I didn't need to look behind me to know that Thornfield was still there, waiting. Watching. I kept driving, heading south, desperate to get as far from that cursed place as possible. The whole time, my hands were gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The road stretched on, but it never felt long enough. The whispers never stopped. They followed me in the car, in my mind, clawing at my thoughts like fingers dragging across glass. They whispered my name, like a chant, calling me back to that place. I tried to push the fear down, tried to convince myself that leaving the town would break the curse, that the horrors I had witnessed were behind me. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape it. Every so often, I would glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Thornfield in the distance, or the figure in the trench coat standing by the side of the road. But nothing ever appeared. Still, the feeling didn't leave. That nagging sense that something was wrong. That something was following. By the time I crossed into another state, I was exhausted. Physically, mentally, I was at my limit. I found a small motel on the outskirts of a town called Bellwood and decided to stop for the night. I thought I could rest, get a few hours of sleep, and start fresh in the morning. But when I checked in, something strange happened. The woman at the desk, her name was Patricia, looked at me in a way I didn't quite understand. She didn't ask for my ID, didn't check my credit card. She simply handed me the room key with a knowing look, like she had been expecting me. Her smile was empty, and I could see something dark behind her eyes. The room was small and dimly lit, just like every other motel I had stayed at, but it had a strange coldness to it, one that sank deep into my bones. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I lay down on the bed, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread, but then, just as I closed my eyes, I heard it. The tapping. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. But then, it was louder, faster. It was coming from the walls, just like before. It was the same pattern, the same rhythm. I sat up, my heart pounding, and the whispers returned, low and guttural, growing louder by the second. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just the motel's old plumbing or the wind, but deep down, I knew what it was. It was them. Thornfield. The whispers, the tapping, they had followed me. I grabbed my phone, but when I tried to call someone, the screen flickered, then went black. I hit the power button repeatedly, but nothing worked. Panic began to rise in my chest, my breaths coming faster, more shallow. The door to the room suddenly swung open. I didn't hear it. It didn't creak or groan. It was just, open. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. The man in the trench coat. His empty eyes locked onto mine. His lips didn't move, but I could hear the words in my mind. You never leave. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything but stare at him, at the darkness in his eyes, the darkness that seemed to stretch out infinitely. And then, I heard something else. Something worse. From behind me, a voice. Not from the man in the trench coat, but from somewhere deeper. Somewhere inside the room, coming from the walls themselves. You're one of us now. I turned, my body moving of its own accord, as if I wasn't in control anymore. There, in the corner of the room, I saw the shadowy figure from the cabin. It wasn't the same as before, though. It was bigger, more solid. And its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at me with a hunger I couldn't escape. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, until my back hit the wall. The floor began to vibrate again, and the whispers grew louder, louder until it felt like the entire room was screaming at me. And then, just as I thought my heart would stop from the terror, I heard one last thing. A voice, soft and cold, right in my ear. Welcome home. I don't know what happened next. I don't know if I passed out, or if everything just went black, but when I came to, the room was empty. The man in the trench coat was gone. The shadow was gone. And yet, I could still feel them. Their presence. The walls were silent, but I knew deep down, I was never going to escape. They had already taken me. The thing about Thornfield is, it doesn't let go. Once it claims you, it owns you. There is no escape. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to outrun it, it will always find you. If you're ever driving through a small town late at night and you see a sign for Thornfield, don't stop. Don't even look at it. Because once you do, it will already be too late. And they will come for you. They always do.